The censorship of journalists, filmmakers, and even citizens is not limited to countries overseas. Here in the United States, journalists are allegedly spied on, accused of crimes. Police prevent photographers from recording events, and America seeks to prosecute whistleblowers. The Obama administration is accused of using the IRS as a weapon to silence its critics and opponents. I am joined here live on set with the Ebru think tank, Mustafa Tabanli, an international journalist, Youhuru Williams from Fairfield University, and Paul Levinson from Fordham University. Paul, I'm going to begin with you. This seems to be an awful age to be a journalist in the United States. What are your thoughts?
It was never a great age, frankly. Journalists have always been on the front line, but it has gotten worse. Occupy Wall Street, for example. What
happened during Occupy Wall Street that was negative towards journalists?
Well, here in the New York City area, I can give you an example. The name of the photographer is Alexander Arbuckle, and he's standing on a corner with his phone, snapping shots of really nothing outrageous, just the demonstrations, police regulating that, but the police didn't like that. So they arrested him, took away his phone, charged him with like an idiotic charge, obstructing justice.
Or disorderly conduct, or whatever they choose to charge you with.
You know, fortunately we have a pretty good court system. So the case was thrown out of court a few years later.
But it has the chilling effect at the moment, because I can tell you as a journalist in the field, when a police officer is grabbing the lens of your camera and pushing it down or threatening to arrest you or actually arresting you for disorderly conduct, it stops you from getting the story at that moment, even if the charges are dismissed later.
You're completely right. And a police lieutenant in the New York City Police Force told me a few years ago, the First Amendment is a joke. And he doesn't want to be quoted by name, but what he meant was the police don't care about the First Amendment. They do whatever they think is appropriate, and if it means interfering with the right of reporters to cover a story, too bad.
Oh, I absolutely feel that police officers in particular view journalists as the enemy. And often average citizens will have more rights in accessing a crime scene than journalists are, because we'll be penned up in one area and not allowed to move, and people will be sipping soda pop standing next to the dead body. It's a very, very strange situation. I am joined by another guest via Skype, Joe Roselius, who is very well adept at this subject matter. He's an expert on whistleblower legislation, and in fact, one of the cases he has worked on involves a journalist who was facing legal troubles by the name of Joseph Hosey. Tell me a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, we represented a reporter named Joe Hosey of Patch.com. Basically, there was a fairly gruesome double murder, and Joe got a hold of some police reports from a confidential source. The defendant in the underlying murder case asked the court to force Joe to disclose the identity of the source, and the court actually granted his request. Joe obviously refused, and the court threatened to throw him in jail if he didn't comply. Luckily, we were able to take it up to the appellate court, and they agreed with us that the identity of the source had really nothing to do with the underlying double murder. But you know, until we got the order from the appellate court, and for almost 15 months, Joe had an order hanging over his head that potentially could have put him in prison.
It's a tough situation for journalists out there. One of the most extreme examples, I would say, Youhuru, is what happened with James Rosen from Fox. He was actually tracked by the Justice Department. His emails were surveilled, and all within the realm of doing his job.
Not unusual given the level of technology that the government now has access to. And there's always been this tension between the proverbial fourth estate, the media, and law enforcement and government officials. And the media does have a very difficult job of trying to expose, share information. Today, particularly, we have media outlets that sometimes people get the impression perform the function basically as propaganda machines. So some people will look at Fox News or MSNBC in that regard. But there has always been this tradition of journalists in the field working to share information, to expose information, to inform the public in ways that they may not have access to, or information they may not have access to. And I think that's what we're losing in the present moment, even as we have access to more technology that allows for the democratization of information.
So it's a double-edged sword. This rings true with you, Mustafa.
Yes, and governments are getting more sophisticated, not in terms of technology, but in terms of manipulation as well. So whenever you have a security versus freedom issue, it's always possible to mobilize citizens for security group, and you buffer them between press and the event so that you make press against the people who are for freedom of or security, etc. And it's a technique that is working very well in Ferguson, for example, and many other places as well.
It's tough when you have a press corps that is now massive. You add to the mix citizen journalists and activist journalists, whether it be Fox or MSNBC or a blog in between, and you have at times persons who are interjecting themselves in the story. Do you see this as a problem at all, Paul?
Maybe, but the greater problem is that the government is using citizen journalism as an excuse to crack down on all journalists. And the truth is, a citizen journalist is reporting the news. It doesn't matter if they don't have a credential. If you're there and you can take a video, there's a fellow by the name of Tim Pool, for example, who does live video streams of protests. He worked for NBC for a while, but he's pretty much now freelance. His videos have been on Ustream, and the police are constantly harassing him. And it's not an equal battle, the police versus the press, because in the end, the police have the guns. Yeah. And that's why the First Amendment should be followed much more strictly.
Well, I always say that if the police are treating me like this, and I have a camera with me and the capacity to show it throughout a metropolitan region, can you imagine what they're doing to the unarmed kid in the hood? They're really pushing that kid around. Talk to me a little bit about the emergence of technology and how it's being abused, Youhuru. You talked to the fact that, you know, we've got this great conduit now to get the story out there, but governments are able to pull the plug and scrutinize people as well. Yeah,
and it goes along with our conversation about the emergence of modern civil liberties. So you have this situation where, again, you have the democratization of information, and sometimes that works to the advantage of the public. Consider the Boston bombing case, where literally you've got real-time reporting from people on the ground throughout the city as that was playing out. The danger associated with that is that the government can also monitor the accounts of people who are engaged in this type of behavior. And while the government has a responsibility to be proactive in looking for potential threats, it is a very thin line between being proactive and actually abusing that power by seeking out enemies of the state, so to speak, and harassing those people both in social media and in real time. You know, it's one thing for the courts to ferret this out later on, but the enormous expense that's borne by journalists who have to go through that process, or even citizen journalists, there's the real issue as well.
Absolutely. Let's turn to Joe Roselius once again, joining us via Skype. Joe, what do you see, give me a state of the First Amendment in the year 2015.
I think there's actually, it's not as much of a protection as I think you'd think it would be. In our case, it was almost all based on Illinois state law protections and not the federal First Amendment. And the other thing I think we're seeing a lot of is there's efforts going on right now to pass stronger legislation, stronger federal legislation to protect reporters. But one of the things we're seeing is there's a big fight over whether or not that's going to protect people who are defined as reporters in some higher sense, or if that includes bloggers and citizen journalists like you were mentioning.
One of the chilling effects I've felt as a journalist, and it's recently happened under the de Blasio administration, they actually wanted to limit the questions that the reporters could ask. For example, if he's addressing a gas explosion in the East Village, no one's allowed to go beyond the realm of questioning that pertains to that one incident. Paul, what are your thoughts on something like that, of the coercive means that politicians sometimes use to control the press?
Well, that kind of behavior is completely antithetical to what the press should be doing. It's absurd that when the press is trying to find information and give it to the public, and they want to ask a question of a mayor, that the mayor can rule that question off limits. And frankly, until someone like Mayor Bloomberg is brought up on some kind of charges for his blatant violation of the First Amendment, I mean, he basically... What
did he do that was offensive?
The police work under him, and he told the police, I want you to make sure that the press doesn't go in and cover cover this particular action of the police. We're trying to clean out this park. He had no right to do that.
Right.
And that kind of thing happens all the time, and the mayors get away with it.
And also cutting off access is a big thing, from the Obama administration deciding who questions are going to be answered to who gets the exclusive interviews. I mean, there's always this quid pro quo with journalists.
And the main goal is to make sure that official story is the only story. That's what they want to establish. And it's like a Groundhog Day. I mean, just you wake up 10 years, 20 years down, there's another security issue. Then you also start over again and then again. We saw this in 1960s, 1945, Second World War. Strange things.
And the playbook remains the same. I mean, I love that point, and I love your point as well, Paul. You consider what happened in Ferguson, where the police basically established a no-fly zone to prevent aerial coverage of the protests that were emerging there, because they recognized that this might galvanize, national support for anti-police protests that were taking place in that city. That's a violation, but I think, to Paul's point, until there's a vigorous prosecution or some real consequences for authorities that engage in that type of behavior, expect authorities to continue to do it, because better to do it and be embarrassed later on because there are no real consequences than not to do it at all and be embarrassed in the moment.
Let me play devil's advocate for just a second, because I'm a journalist, so I let journalists do whatever they want is how I feel. But sometimes the cops have a point. If you put a camera on something, it changes people's behaviors. They perform for the camera. I see it all the time. There'll be a protest line where everybody's got their signs down, they're sitting on the sidewalk, you bring the camera, all of a sudden they're chanting. What about the fact that journalists sometimes incite misbehavior or even crimes? And
well,
you're chomping at the bit. I'm going to let you take that, Paul.
An old story, which is not apocryphal, about some place, I think in Mississippi, where a news crew showed up because someone was threatening to set themselves on fire and commit suicide. And the guy changed his mind. And the news crew said, "Hey, we came out here, and, it's no joke. It really happened." But the problem is this. Often we have competing issues. So even, for example, with the SHIELD laws, what they're designed to do is protect journalists, but that can get in the way of someone getting a fair trial. And what you're talking about, right, sometimes cameras can incite bad behavior. But in the end, we have to choose. And I think the more important goal is to give people in our democracy maximum information. Otherwise, we're going down the road of, whether it's in Ferguson or during Occupy Wall Street, here in the United States of America, the government and the police can get away with all kinds of things, including, in the case of Ferguson, loss of human life.
That's what I said, get away with murder. Absolutely. Let's turn for a final thought to Joe Roselius. Joe, you've been hearing our conversation. What sticks with you most? What's the walk-away message from this today?
I think the First Amendment, the goal of it is to ensure a well-informed citizenry. And the protections that reporters get and the media gets go directly to the rights that all citizens have to know about this kind of activity. And that's the protection we need to keep in mind. It's not just about reporters, it's about everyone.
I agree, Joe. The problem is, unfortunately, that reporters and journalists are held in very low esteem, perhaps because of their own doing in part. Still to come on Fresh Outlook, after getting walloped by a deadly superstorm, New York and New Jersey are still picking up the pieces more than 2 years later. And I've got a question for you. Are we prepared for another storm of similar magnitude? After this.